Welcome back to my YouTube channel here, and welcome to a new series that I plan to do. A new video series where I like to talk about Calgary sports teams from the past year. As you know, or if you're new here, what I mostly do on my YouTube channel here is I talk Calgary sports. Also with the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, with teams that we have right now here. However, I'm going to call this one the Remember the Calgary Series. I call this episode 0 here because this is just my introduction. And I'm going to go over all the teams that I found that I think would be interesting to talk about and maybe to bring back some memories of Calgary sports teams from the past year. As amazingly, when I was going through this list here of all the teams that I could think of that I would like to talk about and find, information on, some teams more so than others here. We've had a few basketball teams. We definitely had a bunch of hockey teams. We've had a few football teams. And we definitely had some baseball teams that I think Calgarians definitely would miss here. And there's one particular event that I think we also missed here that started off that it's a big empire today here. So what inspired me to do what I'm going to call the Remember the Calgary Series, there's definitely were a few sources that inspired me to do this as a Calgary sports fan. I mean, last season, talking about 2018-19 year, the Calgary Hitmen, they had their Corral series where they had 3 games in the Stampede Corral there, the older barn that's still around but it's slated for demolition as part of the Calgary Stampede expansion here. And I made some videos on talking about it and give you my experience on the Calgary Hitmen Corral series there, where they played 3 games, where they were the Calgary Centennials, the first junior hockey team that we had in Calgary, one of the major junior hockey team. Then they were the Calgary Cowboys, the team that was in the World Hockey Association, and then they were the Calgary Wranglers, the last junior hockey team that we had before the Calgary Hitmen. As you know, the Calgary Centennials are now today's Tri-City Americans here. The Calgary Cowboys are defunct. That used to be in the World Hockey Association. And the Calgary Wranglers are now today as the Lethbridge Hurricanes here. So that was the first inspiration part. The second one is, I found this company called Sea of Dead Clothing. That I found it on social media. I see it on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook here, but I mostly see it on Twitter, Instagram here, where they specialize in selling clothing from sports teams from the past here. Mostly the 80s and 90s here, and I'll definitely be talking about those teams there. And then I guess the last thing you can throw in is that, if you remember back in January here, I did a reaction, I gave my story on this Chris Wilson guy, who I think he was, if I remember, he was from Canmore here. He went over and showed his whole hockey collection of hockey jerseys of Calgary teams currently and in the past there. So you can thank those 3 sources for my inspiration on doing this Remember the Calgary Series. And when I was mapping out my episodes here, I put it in no particular order here, but the last couple, I made sure I put those towards the end here because I think most Calgarians will miss that the most here. So I couldn't believe that I mapped out, I think, 26 episodes here. I mean, this is episode 0, the introduction here. But let's go over some teams that I plan to talk about here. Sure, if you have any memories or experiences from any of these teams that I'm going to talk about here. I couldn't believe how many teams there were. And some of these teams have been defunct for over 10, 20 years, or even way in the past year. And, I don't own any of these merchandise here, and maybe I'll eventually buy some merchandise when things ever get better, from this global pandemic here. But I figure I might as well start the series now, because I think this is going to take probably, a couple of years, or maybe a couple of years at most here. If I can release an episode or 2 every month here, that would be good, but I still have my other content to make here. So this is the introduction, episode 0 here. So episode 1, I'm going to talk about The Calgary Rad'z. Remember the Calgary Rad'z? An inline hockey team? I figured I talk about them first, and it's RAD apostrophe Z. That definitely sounds very 90s there, so I figure we'll talk about the Calgary Rad'z. Episode 2, I'll be talking about the Calgary Outlaws here. And actually, in this particular case, and in some episodes here, I'll talk about more than one team, just to make it work in the episode here. Because actually, Calgary had 2 teams that were called the Outlaws here. I'm also going to talk about the baseball team, because briefly we had the Canadian Baseball League, and also we briefly had, a Calgary Outlaws basketball team. And actually, funny thing is, both of those Outlaw teams that I looked up had a similar fate, where they both had great regular seasons, but they could not finish the season to the championship here because their respective leagues folded here. So Calgary Outlaws will be episode 2 here. So episode 3, well, I'll talk about the Calgary Cowboys of the World Hockey Association here, which I think that definitely was a team that maybe planted the seed for the Calgary Flames. And if, maybe if we had a bigger arena at the time here, could the team that is in the NHL right now be the Calgary Cowboys here? And the other interesting thing in that episode that I'll throw in is that actually was not the first team that represented Calgary in the World Hockey Association. I'll briefly talk about the Broncos in that one. However, the Cowboys actually played hockey on the ice in the World Hockey Association. Now that'd be episode 3. Episode 4 here, I think most Calgarians might miss this basketball team, the Calgary 88s. Remember the Calgary 88s? Definitely was probably the highest level basketball team that Calgary had. We never had an NBA team, but I think this was probably the closest that Calgary would get to the NBA there. So that'll be episode 4. Episode 5 here, I'm going to talk about the Calgary Tigers. I'll be talking about the old hockey team. You can say that was the first professional hockey team that the Calgary had. Then we had the Cowboys and then the Flames here. The Calgary Tigers, I understand, played for the Stanley Cup way back in the 1920s, and those jerseys that the Flames wore at the Heritage Classic in 2011 were inspired by the Calgary Tigers here. There was also a rugby team that was named the Tigers here, so I might as well throw that in there. So that'll be episode 5. Episode 6 here, there was some more basketball here. This time, we'll talk about 2 teams that were in the same league here. The Calgary Drillers and the Calgary Crush here. Calgary Crush, I say, is the most recent basketball team that Calgary's had here, and actually the Calgary Crush played at the gymnasium at St. there, so there's some more basketball that the Calgary had, but I think the 88s is the team that I think most Calgarians will probably say missed the most, our basketball fans in Calgary here. Episode 7 here, I'm going to talk about 2 baseball teams in the past here. We actually had the Cardinals and the Expos here, and yes, they were associated with the St. Louis Cardinals and the Montreal Expos at the time here, and they were feeder leaves for that. And those teams came just before, I think, the one baseball team that I think Calgarians missed the most here that I'll talk about later here. So that'll be episode 7. And episode 8, we'll talk about the Calgary Centennials more in depth here. Now the current Tri-City Americans here. Calgary Centennials from the Corral series here. And then number 9, we'll talk about the Calgary Wranglers, who are now the Lethbridge Hurricanes now. So I might as well get all the Corral series and go more in depth on those teams here. So now episode 10 here, we'll actually go to the pitch here, as we'll talk about a different kind of football, or I call it soccer here. I think the biggest team here, most famous team that I think represents soccer in Calgary is the Boomers. So I'll talk about the Calgary Boomers here. And then number 11 here, I'll talk about 2 teams because I think this team changed their name, or I think there were 2 separate teams here. Episode 11, the Strikers and Kickers. Oh yeah, those are definitely very original names for a soccer team. So that'll be episode 11. And then episode 12 here, we'll talk about the Storm and the Mustangs. I remember briefly we had the Calgary Storm, and they played at the Foothills Athletic Park there, between McMahon Stadium and Foothills Stadium, or Burns Stadium there. So we'll talk about that. And also, I think in one of those soccer episodes, I'll talk about Calgary United. There was another indoor soccer team that briefly in there, so I'll throw that in there. So that's episode number 12 here. Episode 13, this is not all about the guys here. Episode 13, we'll talk about the Calgary Inferno here. The National Women's Hockey League team that now is no longer with us. They actually won the Clarkson Cup in 2019 and folded here. And the National Women's Hockey League is definitely on shaky ground already at best times before all this. But let's talk about the Calgary Inferno here. So there are definitely going to be some ladies in this series here that I plan to do. And then number 14, I'll be talking about the Bronx here. The Bronx football team. And actually that was the football team that preceded the Calgary Stampeders right now here. So that'll be episode 14. Now episode 15, I'll be talking about the Calgary Stampeders. Not the football team, but the hockey team. As actually we had some Calgary Stampeders hockey back in the day there. And interestingly, the Edmonton Eskimos also was a hockey team there. And actually there was also, I forgot to mention something extra I would talk about when I do talk about the Cardinals and Expos there, when I looked up, Calgary baseball teams from the past here. Actually, there was a Calgary Stampeders baseball team that played in the 1910s here. So, they'll definitely be talking some Stampeders from the past and not football in this case here. So, number 16, I'll be talking about the Calgary Canadians here. And actually, the Calgary Canadians is the only Calgary-based team, as of this recording, to win the Memorial Cup. The Hitmen had two chances. Made it to the Memorial Cup twice, but did not win the championship here. But the Calgary Canadians did. So I figure I'll talk about the Calgary Canadians here. Episode 17 here, I'll talk about the Dogs. And actually that team, you could say, still exists. Still sort of in Calgary. I'm going to talk about the Calgary Dogs. Now they're in Okotoks here. They definitely had at least great disagreement with the Vipers, and yes, I'll be talking about the Vipers in this series here. But the Okotoks Dogs now were the Calgary Dogs, so I'll talk about them in that episode here. And then number 18, I'll talk about some more Alberta junior hockey teams. There was the Calgary Buffaloes and Cowboys, so there was another hockey team named the Cowboys in Calgary, but not at professional level here. So Buffaloes and Cowboys, yeah, it definitely fits in with the Western Heritage and Hospitality here. And then number 19, I plan to talk about the Calgary Mustangs and then the A16 Currie Army here. There was a couple of hockey teams that played during the Second World War there, and there was a Victoria team that we'll talk about as well during that time. That's why I looked, some of these hockey teams I looked up on hockeydb.com and looked up Calgary there, and I couldn't believe all the teams I saw here. So I figured I might as well talk about all the Calgary teams, not leave anyone out when I mapped out my episodes here. And now episode 20 here. More hockey teams, we'll call it the Rangers and Bronx. So there was a couple more hockey teams here. And then 21 here. We'll talk about one franchise that has changed names over the years here, but actually recently left the Alberta Junior Hockey League to go to Black Falls, I believe. There was a team that was called the Chinooks to the Mustangs here. So they had 4 different names. So I'll talk about that team in that episode here. The only Alberta Junior Hockey League team that has survived, that's still around, is the Calgary Canucks here. But keep in mind, I'm talking about Calgary teams from the past here. So that's why I call it Remember the Calgary Series. So episode 22, I'm going to be talking about the Cougars and Trojans here, and not talking about the collegiate or university teams. We actually had a team, one was actually called the Mount Royal Cougars and the Calgary Trojans here. So definitely, we'll talk about that. I found this all on Hockey Database here. Episode 23, we'll be talking about the Vipers. Actually, all these teams that I've listed here, many of these teams actually happened before my time here, and either in my much younger days where I didn't go to as many sport events. But the Vipers was the games that I went to the most there, where I got this cap here, and the Vipers are no longer around here. And then episode 24, I think Calgarians will miss this baseball team the most here, the Calgary Cannons. I think most people that would comment here will probably say they remember the Cannons the most here. I think that's the closest major professional team that Calgary's had in this series is the Calgary Cannons here, as we were the AAA team for most of the time for the Seattle Mariners here. But I remember we were also the farm team for the Chicago White Sox, remember the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Florida Marlins there, And then eventually that team actually moved to Albuquerque to be the Isotopes, and they're now still the Albuquerque Isotopes there. And then episode 25, I think I'm going to try to talk about Stampede Wrestling. I think that's definitely another thing that many Calgarians before my time probably missed the most here, is the Cannons and Stampede Wrestling there. And I made sure I put those towards the end there. And Stampede Wrestling definitely, the Hart family legacy definitely lives on here. And some, you know, wrestlers that when you get to the now Vince McMahon has the Empire with the used to be called the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, but then they had a trademark issue with the World Wildlife Foundation there, so that's when they changed to the World Wrestling Entertainment here. But there used to be regionalized wrestling in North America here, and Calgary was the heart of Stampede Wrestling here, and there were definitely some big-time wrestlers that were in Stampede Wrestling, including the Hart family, that eventually made it to WWE or F, depending on what area you're talking about there. But you can thank Stampede Wrestling for a little bit of what the Empire is today. Then episode 26, I might as well just recap it all here. So I think this is definitely going to be a fun, interesting project here. Is looking back on Calgary teams from the past here, and I definitely was impressed how many teams there were. I definitely remember some of these teams. I mean, obviously I went to Vipers games. I did go to a few Cannons games, and definitely remember those teams. I do remember the Outlaws, both baseball, and I do remember the basketball. I didn't find as much information on the basketball. All I know is that they played at the Jack Simpson gym at the university there. And I remember the logo looked a little like Yosemite Sam, and I couldn't find the logo. But he was pointing guns and the bullets went through his hat there. I remember that. And then, I was definitely, the Centennials and the Cowboys from the Corral series was before my time, and I was in my infancy for the Wranglers there, so I don't remember the Wranglers much. I do actually briefly remember the Rad'z. I remember seeing highlights from the Rad'z on Global TV or 2 and 7 at the time there. I never went to any games, but I briefly remember that. I do remember the 88s. I think I might have actually went to some games, if I remember here. But there was one hockey team I think I remember that I couldn't find any information on. I remember we briefly had the Calgary Rad'z, but I couldn't find any information on it. I remember they played at the Saddledome as well, but I couldn't find any information on it, so I'm not too sure if I'll include that in this series in one of my hockey episodes, but those are some of the teams I remember here, but hopefully for those of you who are waiting for me talking about Calgary sports teams from the past here, that's what I plan to do, and I think it's going to take, maybe a few years to go through all these episodes here, but this is my plan. I'm going to call it the Remember the Calgary Series, and I came up with a template for the thumbnail that I'll use for this series here, but I'll ask it to you there. What Calgary teams from the past do you remember the most here? Do you remember some of those older teams if you're around then? What team do you miss the most? Could Calgary ever support basketball again? Could we support baseball team again? Obviously, it won't be, AAA, or it would need an indoor stadium, because I don't think Calgary's a big enough market to, support an NBA team or a Major League Baseball team, because I do remember talking about the NBA and basketball here. I remember when there was the Raptors and the Grizzlies, when they played in Vancouver, that they had the Naismith Cup there, and it was a preseason tournament where they had the Grizzlies and Raptors. They played in various cities around Canada there. Just a little tournament there, and whoever won wins the Naismith Cup there. I do remember seeing Raptors and Grizzlies at the Saddledome here. Although I do remember one time they had problems with the court there, and it was like an hour delay, and I remember that they said, oh, it was free compensation. You can get a free drink, and suddenly everyone was like running to the concourse to get a free pop. I don't think I took one. I didn't think I got a free small pop because I wasn't willing to wait that long. But that's my Remember the Calgary Series, what I plan to do here. That's my introduction. What teams do you remember, miss, would you like back somehow? But, as I say, the Corral series, Sea of Dead Clothing, and that CBC story inspired me to make this, videos on this in the future here. And I think if any announcements on when I plan to release a new video, I would say see my Instagram or Twitter here because I think I can promote the video that way, show the logo, and show the thumbnail here. So as I say, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, home of the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, and formerly the home of all the teams that I plan to do in this Remember the Calgary series. I mostly talk Calgary sports, and I think it's fitting to, remember some of these teams in the past and do some research on it and make some videos on it. I also do personal vlogs, attempt a comedy, and I also share my experiences on the road around a sporting event here, so that all sounds like you'd be interested to watch to follow along this Calgary sports fans journey. You know what you need to do, and I also have my other social media links down in the description below there to maybe find out when I plan to release my next episode in the Remember the Calgary series. And of course, this is just a plan. This is what I drafted here. It could still be subject to change, or maybe add to it if things change. But I plan on making videos on this going in the future here, and hopefully it's worth the wait for those who have been waiting for it. So as I say here, I'll see you in the next video here.